Hey guys, Zack here, and this is my review of Scooby-Doo Mystery Incorporated. Okay, so to start off, this episode kind of confirms a couple of my theories that I've been having. So, namely regarding who Mr. E is, and his relationship to Mystery Incorporated, which I kind of speculated back in Escape from Mystery Mansion. But yeah, this episode, and also there's this episode where we actually learn a little bit more about who all the some of the different characters are and some of the different relationships and what they do. But yeah, this episode it opens up with Dylan and Brenda, who I should mention have kind of been sidelined in the series a little bit. They showed up at the beginning of Revenge of the Man Crab and were attacked, and continuity wise they come back here, but they're badly injured from their attack and have only just gotten out of the hospital. But in case they show up at the amusement park Spooky Creepy Terrorlands, which we do eventually meet the owner of Spooky Creepy Terrorland, but what we find out in the cold open is that apparently the amusement park isn't doing very well. As we find out, there's been some problems and not enough people have been coming into the park to actually buy tickets, and Dylan even mentioned this as well, pointing out that while they should be recuperating from the fact that they were attacked by a Manticore, or rather specifically were attacked by the man crab. They get attacked by the Manticore later in this episode, just spoiler, but in case as they're recovering from their attack by the man crab, and they even mentioned that they probably should be taking it easy. Dylan does mention that since the tickets are free, they are pretty cheap, they might as well come in, and sure enough, they immediately go to this guy who does one of those seat rides where you shoot up and shoot back down, one of those. I don't know what the names of the rides are called, by the way. I just know what they look like, and you can probably figure them out based on my description. But in case they talk to the guy running the ride, who is very much out of it, and is very much not really paying attention to what's going on in front of him. Just he sees two people walk up, asks them to get on the ride, and they do, and then he immediately turns on the ride once they are properly secured, even though they admit that they probably not a very good idea to go up with their injuries. But in any case, once they're at the top of the ride, Dylan and Brenda have a bit of a heart-to-heart about how they can see all of Crystal Cove from the top of the ride, and point out that even though, despite all of the things that kind of happens, they do point out that there is definitely hope for the future, and do hope that Crystal Cove will one day be a much better place to live. And the two try to share a kiss, but because of the seat restraints, they can't. But they ultimately decide to put a pin in their newfound recorded love for each other, and it's still very much a spoof of that one couple that I mentioned that they're supposed to be a spoof of. But as they kind of have this conversation, they're suddenly attacked by a Manticore who picks them up, ride and all, and kind of plucks their seat from the ride and rips it out of its foundation, and proceeds to tell them that this world is now under the domain of the Manticore, and proceeds to fly off. And in the process, Brenda actually drops her crutch, which and to just add to the fact that the guy is really just going through the motions. The ticket guy, he sees the cane fall in front of him, and he doesn't even register the fact that it's not even a person. He just immediately goes into a spiel about telling them to enjoy the ride, which just shows that he's just so tuned out to what's going on in reality. And that's where the cold open ends. But it then cuts to Angel Dynamite riding up to Destroido Corporation in her motorcycle, and she actually winds up infiltrating Destroido from the sewer. She actually winds up infiltrating it from one of its many sewer pipes that are just dumping chemical waste and a whole bunch of other things into the surrounding environment. And from there, we then get a montage of her slowly sneaking her way through Destroido Corporation, sneaking past security guards and security systems, and it eventually ends with her doing a series of acrobatics to get through a kind of like a maze of light. Like a maze of lasers that are supposed to detect when somebody's through them, and she gets success. And despite getting successfully through all of those, she does eventually wind up getting trapped in a trap, which is just this giant glass tube. And at which point Ed Machine comes out to greet her, and she points out that she wouldn't have bothered sneaking through all of the security systems if she had known that it was just a ploy to get Ed's attention, and then demands to see Mr. E. And this is the first time we actually see him, but we don't actually see him until the end of the episode. But this is indeed the first time we've seen him in person throughout the entire run of the series. And sure enough, Angel shows up and starts asking questions of Mr. E about who, and sure enough, she knows full well who Mr. E is, because as we find out through Mr. E, and this does confirm my theory that he is indeed Ricky. He confirms that Mr. E is not, that they are indeed old members of Mystery Incorporated, and also we see him in a giant security room full of monitors, which kind of confirms how he's been able to actually just follow all the things that have been going on with the plot of the series. He's just been monitoring everybody with possibly secret security cameras, and that's likely how he knows everything. He literally just sits there watching security feeds all day and probably knows everything. And also the fact that he's in charge that he's inside Destroyer Corporation does kind of confirm that he is indeed the owner of Destroyer Corporation, and Ed Machine is just a puppet figure that he employs as CEO. But in case after that bit of that revelation, he and Angel have a bit of a back and forth, with Angel pointing out that while she is working with Mr. E, she's not working for him, and does point out that she is ultimately concerned about the kids, pointing out that they found a pound piece of the disc, but she also mentions that that anybody could be looking for it, and mentions Professor Pericles in particular is looking for it, which could potentially put them in danger, but Mr. E ultimately points out that he isn't too concerned about it, and that he knows that Pericles likely won't try and pull anything if he thinks he can get away with it. But in case, and then he also mentions that that the only real people he's worried about are the other two members of the group, which are presumed to be Brad and Judy. But he also points out that they likely won't get involved so long as Fred Jones is alive. And of course, it's at this point where we actually cut to Mystery Inc. in Fred Jones Sr.'s office at the town hall, and what we find out is that the Manticore that punctuated the start of the episode is in fact his fault. As we find out, and this is the reason why he calls him Mystery Incorporated to begin with. As we find out, he apparently bought the temple that the Manticore is currently residing in he apparently bought it as an attraction to kind of save creepy spooky Terrorland. He wanted, and of course Fred is very over the moon over the fact that his dad is trying to bond with him, kind of sort of, but Fred Jones Sr. just keeps dismissing him and pointing out that and then continues to tell his story about how the fact that he bought it online, which Daphne kind of chides him about a little bit, pointing out that people don't buy temples online, but when he gives her a death glare, she shuts up, and he continues the story, pointing out that he bought it mainly because he wanted to boost revenue from the town, and then he found out the Manticore was actually eating people, so he kind of chalks it up to quote unquote buyer's remorse. So. And the reason he recruits Mr. Incorporated is because he wants them to actually go in and investigate and figure out what's going on with the Manticore and possibly trap it. And with that, Fred is very much over the moon over the fact that his dad wants his help, and does ultimately declare that he's happy that they'll actually be able to bond, and points out all of the fun things that they're going to be doing while investigating. Pointing out that they'll be setting traps, going on stakeouts, and a whole bunch of other fun stuff that he can't wait to share with his dad. But it's then revealed that Fred Sr. isn't actually going to be partaking in any of that, and Fred kind of becomes disheartened a little bit, but understands completely. And with that, Mr. E then proceeds to leave and goes to creepy spooky Terrorland. And it's at this point where they actually go over to the amusement park to go and investigate, with Fred immediately going into the idea that they need to go and start investigating and set up traps to actually trap the Manticore, and of course with Scooby and Shaggy pointing out that they just want to look into the food and point out that they need to go find some food and point out that they hope that the amusement park has some fun things to eat. At which point, a man who we later will find out is the owner of the amusement park, he tells the two of them that they actually do have some pretty great nachos, and it's at this point where Shaggy and Scooby immediately turn around and run into him by accident, and also hot dog water. And what we find out is that, which causes Shaggy and Scooby to become disoriented because they ran into him and wonders if where the nachos are at. But it's at this point where the man actually introduces himself as Winslow Fleech and reveals that hot dog water is actually his daughter. Which implies that her last name is Fleech, but we don't actually find out her full name because Winslow only refers to her as Dear, and everybody else insists on calling her Hot Dog Water. So of course we never actually find out what her full name is. But in case, as we find out, Winslow then kind of greets them and points out that the park apparently isn't doing well, despite the fact that they brought a Manticore in, and of course the Manticore isn't helping at all. So of course he's very worried about the fact that he may have to shut down the park, which he also points out means he won't be able to pay to put his daughter through school anymore because of course the amusement park is his main source of income. But yeah, unfortunately he points out that apparently Hot Dog Water won't be able to go through college because he's no longer able to afford her education, and also what we find out is that Hot Dog Water and Velma have a bit of a rivalry going on. As we find out, they were both in the science fair together, and Velma keeps winning. So of course, Hot Dog Water kind of bitterly resents her for that, and even outright admits that to her dad, as well as to Velma's face. And but in any case, with that, they then decide to go off and try and figure out how they're actually supposed to go off and save the park. And it's at this point where they decide to actually break off and investigate. And but of course, Scooby and Shaggy immediately think that that's going to be nachos, but that they're going to go investigate that. But of course, Velma tells them no because Fred points out that they're actually going to investigate the old Mayan temple that Fred Sr. bought, and does proceed to point out that they're going to be doing that instead, and they're not going to be allowed to investigate the nachos. So of course, Shaggy and Scooby are a little disheartened, and this then cuts to them actually inside the Mayan temple going to investigate, and it looks about what you would expect from a Mayan ruin. I'm just gonna be perfectly honest. It looks exactly like what you would expect. But in case, of course, Scooby and Shaggy are a little disheartened about the fact that they don't get to investigate nachos because, as they point out, food is one of the best ways to actually go and investigate and find new things. And of course, as they point out, investigating nachos is just delicious. But of course, Velma kind of scolds them a little bit and also points out that the main reason they're going into the Mayan temple is to actually go and investigate and figure out what exactly is going on with the Manticore, since obviously the Manticore has made its home in the Mayan temple, and points out that of course it would be a much better idea to go and investigate and find some potential leads, and also Fred points out that they actually have to go out and trap it as well and try to deal with it as well, so that his father will properly acknowledge him, as he points out. But eventually they do wind up in the main temple, which has a giant face of a Mayan god in it, and it is a kind of a really cool visual that probably won't come through very well in a review, which is fair. That's why I always say during these, go watch the actual thing I'm reviewing instead of relying on me to accurately portray what's going on with what's going on. But yeah, in case they walk in and proceed to start, and Fred immediately starts admiring the architecture, and as does everybody else. And of course, Fred immediately points to some of the shadows, pointing out that would be a good place to set a trap. But of course, what he actually winds up pointing to is the Manticore, who climbs out and tells them to get out. And then also declares that it'll feast on their bones. At which point the rest of Mr. Inc. try to flee, except for Fred, who tries to stand his ground against the Manticore and tries to trap it. But Of course, that doesn't want. Of course, that only results in Daphne grabbing him and pulling him away, and they eventually hide in a small corridor where the Manticore passes them, and everybody points out that was close, except for Fred, who I should point out is very, and this has been obvious, but he's very keen on the fact of trapping this Manticore for his dad, because he and points out that they'll have to get back out there to go and trap it, and points out that they'll likely need bait, and starts wondering aloud who has the tastiest bones, with Daphne just kind of scolding him. But it's at this point where Velma notices something deeper in the temple, and of course they go in to discover the actual attraction inside the temple. Of course, what we find, of course, it was heavily implied in the episode, and at outright stated at points that they actually turned the Mayan temple into a ride, and of course they find a giant roller coaster set just built inside the Mayan temple, and concluding that the best way to actually figure out what's going on with the Mayan temple would be to ride the ride and get some more information so that they can get out that way. And of course, Scooby and Shaggy are immediately on board with the idea of being able to go through on the amusement park ride, and of course immediately set it up so that they can actually get into a cart, and Scooby turns it on and hits the power, and and all five of them proceed to get into the amusement park, with Scooby and Shaggy just kind of happy about the fact that they get to take it a little bit easily, but they also point out that they'll need to actually investigate the temple itself, pointing out that they'll need to figure out where exactly Fred Sr. actually got the temple in the first place, since of course it's very strange that he just kind of bought a temple and doesn't really understand where he got it. So yeah, of course, they also point out that they'll need to look into it, and hopefully, and Fred is very open about the fact that they should do it for his dad's sake. So of course, the group decides that should be their next move. But in any case, it's at this point where they actually wind up being attacked by the Manticore, who actually finds them. And with Shaggy ironically boasting previously that riding in the roller coaster is actually the best way to get away from the Manticore, when in actuality it just found them immediately and tries to impale them. And of course, this results in the Manticore knocking the roller coaster off its track and trying to knock them all out of it. But ironically enough, the Manticore's tail actually winds up getting stuck, and he's unable to actually free himself. And it's at this point where another roller coaster comes along, and the rest of the group climbs inside, leaving the Manticore well behind. While the Manticore kind of bellows about the confounding mortal contraption and how it needs to free him. And the Manticore really just commits to the bit, but in any case, after leaving the Manticore well behind, the group then proceeds to regroup at K-Ghoul and try to figure out what exactly is going on with the Manticore. And of course, Angel is very much openly trying to help, and openly tries to help them with their lead. At which point, as we find out that the Manticore, Velma then proceeds to remember that there is actually that Fred Sr. actually bought it off a website. So she immediately goes to Google the website and looks closer at it, and of course, everybody, the immediate thing that becomes obvious is that everything has been sold, and that the ancient temple was actually the last thing that they needed to sell. But then Velma actually looks a little bit closer and points out that it's beyond that, and that all of the things that it's selling are actually fake. Case in point, Fred then proceeds to take a closer look and discovers that one of the things it's actually selling is the Statue of Liberty, which of course is not a haunted attraction at all. So that winds up becoming a bit of a red flag that whoever did this very much set up the site specifically to trick somebody into buying the Mayan temple. So of course, with that information in mind, Angel then suggests that they actually split up and go and both investigate both Fred Sr.'s purchase of the temple, as well as the actual amusement park itself, to look for clues. And of course, Velma, Daphne, and Fred go off to interrogate Fred Sr. while Shaggy and Scooby gleefully go off to go investigate the amusement park, until they find out they're not allowed to investigate the nachos, which causes them to become very, very sad. And with that, they then proceed to leave and go investigate. But while the group is leaving, Angel actually stops Velma, and the two of them then proceed to have a bit of a conversation with Angel asking if she's actually revealed her secret to the rest of the group, and of course Velma points out that she hasn't actually revealed that Angel is really Cassidy Williams, but she also points out that Cassidy said she would, and Angel does point out that she will eventually reveal that she is indeed a member of the previous Mystery Incorporated, but it's not safe. But she also admits that it's not safe for her to do that just yet, and also proceeds to ask Velma what happened to her piece of the Planet Spirit disc, and Velma proceeds to point out that Fred has it, which she points out is probably as safest place as any, and points out that it's very important to be safe, since she also points out that it'll be safe from anybody who's trying to look for it, and but when Velma tries to pry for more information, she merely admits that it's better she doesn't know. So with that, Velma then proceeds to leave. And of course, they immediately go into Fred Sr.'s office, where it's heavily implied that he's one. And I mean, this was outright somewhat confirmed in a previous episode, but it's more so implied here that he's one of the people looking for the Planet Spirit disc alongside Pericles. And of course, he's very much looking into it. He's very much looking into the pieces of a Planet Spirit disc. He pulls out a strange document that we don't get a full glimpse of, but is implied to be related to the Planet Spirit disc in some way. When of course 3/5 of Mystery Incorporated walk in, and he quickly stuffs it in his desk. And when Velma asks him what he's doing, when Velma and Daphne ask him what he's doing, he immediately comes up with a lie on the spot, because he doesn't want them knowing what's going on. That's he's actually looking into a museum for him to be built about him, for a museum exhibit for him to be built about him when he eventually resigns as mayor. But of course, Velma then proceeds to point out the very obvious contradiction in that statement, and that former mayors don't get exhibits in museums about them. As we find out, only the president, only whatever president was actually reigning will actually get an exhibit about them, which means eventually Donald Trump is going to get his own exhibit in a museum. Think about that for a minute. But in case with that, he also points out that he actually was planning to put a veto on the whole museum thing, which he realizes he was caught in a lie, so he had to cover for himself. But it's at this point where Velma decides to ask him what exactly he knows about the site he bought the Mayan temple off of, and all he points out is that he actually didn't really look into it all that deeply. He just typed haunted temples into Google, and that is what he will ultimately wind up getting. He just kind of found the result. It was like, oh, this is gonna be a steal. Bought it, and now that's a problem. And of course, realizing that it didn't really seem like he was actually looking into it all too deeply, concludes that it was likely that they conclude that was actually a pretty big piece of information, and proceed to walk off. And of course, the minute they're out of the room, Fred Sr. immediately goes back to his document once he thinks the coast is clear. So he immediately pulls it out and starts investigating it again. But meanwhile, Shaggy and Scooby are, well, they kind of are keeping their word. I should mention, they're not investigating the nachos. They're investigating literally every other piece of food that's in the amusement park. And of course, the next thing on their docket is to actually go and investigate the churros, which they openly admit was the next thing on the list anyway. And they're just kind of doing that on the premise that they're going through a loophole where they're allowed to investigate everything except the nachos. So of course they go through every other food. But as they're going to investigate the churros, they suddenly smell something strange, and proceed to point out that they actually see Winslow Fleach as well as hot dog water, and they walk by and are currently running through numbers on how to actually save the park. And what we find out is that apparently they have a lot of unsold Charcar Gothagon plushies that they're trying to get rid of. And it's at this point where Winslow actually concludes that what we find out is Winslow actually concludes that concludes after seeing Shaggy and Scooby standing by the churro machine is that the best way to get rid of them is to actually give them away with every purchase of churro. And of course, Hot Dog Water concludes that actually is a good idea, and also points out that it's likely that's likely going to be the only thing they can do, so long as they still have a Manticore problem. And then shoots daggers at Shaggy and Scooby, and points out that that as long as Mystery Incorporated isn't actually solving any of their problems, they might as well do the best that they can. And Shaggy and Scooby, taking Hot Dog Water's words to heart, do ultimately decide that she's right and decide to actually start doing their job and investigating. And that lasts for about 5 seconds because they immediately get bored and decide that they should actually go and look for something else to actually go and do while they investigate. And of course, the first thing they do is actually decide to board a roller coaster, which they do point out would actually be a pretty good place to actually investigate as any because of the high vantage point. And of course they get on and point out that from up high they could easily see where the Manticore is, and conclude that it likely is the best place to go. And of course this doesn't really last long, because immediately the Manticore scoops them up and tries to drop them from a very tall height, pointing out that this will be their end. And of course, they admit that this is a very dangerous thing. That this is very dangerous, and that they're likely going to die. But they actually don't. They actually wind up landing on top of one of those. I don't know what the ride is called, but it's one of those little swing set things that just spin on the little pivot. Those things. Yeah, they land on top of one of those and start kind of running to keep up with it. But then the Manticore scoops them up again and declares that this time it's going to actually kill them. With Scooby and Shaggy concluding that this is not good and that this is likely the end of them. But of course the Manticore immediately drops them, but it drops them on one of those bouncy castles, and they wind up surviving that way. They wind up landing on the bouncing castle, and it cushions their fall. With everybody concluding that is likely, with everybody kind of coming up to them and being very distraught. Of course, Winslow Fleach is the first one to come up, since he owns the park and noticed and saw the whole thing. And he immediately comes up and tells them that he hopes they're okay, but also points out that that's 3 rides now that they owe him for, which they conclude they do kind of nod to each other and point out that's more than fair. At which point the rest of Mystery Inc. comes over, and seeing that Scooby and Shaggy are now strung up over the bouncy castle, then proceed to ask them what happened. And of course Scooby and Shaggy admit that they were dropped by the Manticore, but notably their voice sounds a little bit funny and a little bit high pitched, and Velma even points out, and Daphne even points out that they do sound a little bit funny, and wonders if they've been sucking down helium balloons. But Scooby and Shaggy point out that they were in close proximity of the Manticore, and wonders if that's what happens when you sniff too much Manticore. But it's at this point which catches Velma's attention as a little bit odd, and but in any case, it's at this point where Winslow actually winds up sitting down and declares on the spot that he should probably shut down the amusement park right then and there, with Hot Dog Water kind of consoling him, pointing out that that's probably the best idea. But Fred ultimately decides that no, he can't shut down the park, because as he points out, the fact that Fred Sr. bought something to actually go and investigate and to actually save the park is indeed a safe place for them to, is indeed a more than enough reason for him to continue investigating, because as he points out, the fact that his father bought the temple in the first place means that he wants the park to succeed, and he's going to make it succeed. He's going to help his father make it succeed regardless, and maybe finally give him the attention that he deserves. And declares that he does have an idea of what he needs to do, and that they're ultimately going to go and trap it. And with that, he and Velma then proceed to go back to his house, and it's at this point where Fred points out that they're going to need several different things, such as tennis rackets, a stapler, and some of the nacho cheese from the thing, and also halibut, which he points out the latter is actually in his room, and tells Velma to go get it, and also go find his father, and also points out that he keeps the halibut in his room for emergency reasons, and of course Velma does go into his room, but also discovers that Fred Sr. is there for some reason, and And he's clearly, and he's very clear, and if it wasn't obvious before, it's very much more obvious now. He's looking for the piece of Fred's piece of the Planet Spirit disc, and is rooting and is very much rooting through the trap, and is very much rooting through Fred's room. And when Velma asks him what exactly it is he's doing, he points out that he's actually looking for the receipt for his for the Mayan temple that he bought, which she also points out is a little preposterous since it wouldn't be in Fred's room. But he ultimately points out that it's always in the last place you look, and then makes kind of a hasty retreat and leaves. At which point Velma finds the bags of halibut that Fred was talking about and scoops them up and tucks them under her arm and meets up with Fred, who has found the rest of the trapping materials that they need. But it's at this point where she actually asks Fred what he actually did with the piece of his Planet Spirit disc, and it's at this point where Fred actually points out that he gave it to Shaggy and Scooby. And when Velma is a little bit confused as to why he would trust something so important to them, he does point out that it's exactly for that reason that he entrusted it to them, because obviously it's Shaggy and Scooby, and by Fred's own admission, they're the last people you'd expect to have something important, and which does kind of wind up impressing Velma a little bit, and she even admits it, that to Fred, and points out that sometimes his wisdom astounds her. And it's at this point, and then they immediately go back to the amusement park to go and trap the Manticore, where Shaggy and Scooby are currently being covered in nacho cheese and are trying very hard not to lick themselves clean, because of course, as Daphne points out, that's the only way they're actually going to be able to bait the Manticore into coming and attacking them. And of course, if they lick up the nacho cheese, then the halibut won't stick. But in case, Fred then proceeds to stick the halibut to them, and much to Scooby and Shaggy's chagrin, and of course, they even admit why they're doing this again. But it's at this point where Fred reveals what his trap actually is, and I don't think this would have actually worked, but the way he describes it is that they're going to smack it with tennis rackets, and then once it goes down, pin its wings to the ground with staplers, which isn't going to work, like, at all. But Fred doesn't know that. But in case it's at this point, when he comes over and discovers that when he goes to actually go set the trap in the motion, he discovers that Scooby and Shaggy, despite all their best efforts, actually ultimately weren't able to ultimately did succumb to their urges of eating, and do ultimately eat the halibut. So yeah, that doesn't wind up working out all that much. But which also causes the rest of the group to become a little bit disheartened about the fact that they now no longer have a Manticore trap. But of course, Velma has no idea how to actually proceed forward now that they don't have the trap. But then she actually winds up smelling something very, very strange, and when Daphne kind of points out that that's likely halibut and nacho cheese sauce, Velma points out that it actually smells a little bit more distinct, but it's at this point where the Manticore actually winds up showing up and almost grabs Velma, but Daphne pushes her out of the way and winds up getting grabbed instead. And this causes Fred to actually chase after Daphne and start climbing up rides to try and get to the Manticore. And he does eventually reach her by climbing up the side of the roller coaster and grabbing her. But at which point, Fred actually winds up losing his grip, and Velma goes to catch him. And eventually Shaggy joins them as well and tries to catch Velma, but he quickly realizes that there's nobody to catch him. And eventually he winds up letting go of the roller coaster, and they all wind up sailing through the air on the back while being hung from the Manticore. And it's at this point where Scooby actually comes to the rescue and jumps off one of the rides himself to actually land on top of the Manticore, which does cause the rest of Mystery Incorporated to be dropped by the Manticore, and Scooby and with Shaggy shouting encouragement to Scooby from the ground, and tells Scooby to continue wrestling with the Manticore to defeat it, and basically tells him to ride it, which Scooby admits he's trying to do, but of course the Manticore is very much trying to shake him off, and which eventually results in the Manticore's eyes being covered because Scooby is trying to grab onto him, and they eventually crash into a fortune-telling machine, and the Manticore goes down, and also deflates like a balloon, which Velma notes is suspicious, and it's at this point where she realizes that they now have an idea of what the Manticore actually is. And she immediately goes over to unmask it, and and at which point Winslow Fleach actually comes over as well, wondering if they finally caught the Manticore, and of course she actually winds up unmasking it to reveal that it's actually hot dog water. As we find out, and this has been implied in the episode, but also several episodes before this, but hot dog water is a computer genius, and of course it makes perfect sense that she would be the one to actually set up the phony website, and of course she doesn't actually have it, but of course Velma doesn't actually have a reason as to why hot dog water has been attacking everybody at the amusement park. And of course, Hot Dog Water decides to shoot back at Velma, pointing out that her intellect was always superior to Velma's, which is kind of ironic considering Velma was the one to figure it out. But it's at this point where we find out that apparently the specific type of steel used to make all the rides in creepy spooky Terrorland are actually a key component in making some sort of super helium. And when Hot Dog Water figured that out after experimenting on it one Friday night where she didn't have a date, which Velma points out isn't surprising. She ultimately discovered that it could be indeed be used to make super helium, and realizing that the best way to actually harvest the steel was to chase everybody out and close the park. She dressed up as the Manticore and used what super helium she had made to keep the Manticore afloat. And of course her idea was to chase everybody out so she could harvest all the steel and sell it to the Australian Zeppelin fleet, which is kind of preposterous, but she also points out that it would have made her a lot more richer than Velma ever would. And it's at this point where the cops actually show up, and Sheriff Stone doesn't show up, but one of his fellow cops shows up and arrests her, and she immediately puts her hand over her head. But Fred ultimately points out that something is very strange about all of it, and does point out that he feels like something's missing, and of course, it's at this moment where the fortune teller actually where the damaged fortune teller machine just spits out a card that says, "Meddling kids and dog will ruin your plan." But in case with that, Hot Dog Water is then arrested, and then immediately hauled off and then taken away by the police. And then the episode ends with Angel Dynamite then proceeding to meet with Mr. E again, and reveals that she actually has indeed figured out where Fred's piece of this Playing Spirit disc is. As we find out, she actually slipped a bug on Velma when she went to stop her from leaving Kagul, and proceed to point out that now she knows who has the Playing Spirit disc, but not where. And does tell Mr. E that Shaggy and Scooby ultimately have it, and Mr. E is happy with this, pointing out that while he does know that it's going to be a little bit difficult to figure things out, he does ultimately point out that Scooby was ultimately a much better companion than Professor Pericles ever was to him. And then he turns around, and then we finally see what he looks like, he kind of does look a little bit like himself, like Ricky Owens, but a lot fatter and a lot hairier. So yeah, it's clear he's been in exile for quite a long time. He hasn't been around for quite a while, but yeah, I do like this episode because it does kind of confirm finally that Mr. E is indeed Ricky Owens, which I did kind of speculate a long time ago, but it is finally bearing fruit here, and it does kind of make me happy that my theory wound up being right. But also more to the point, this episode does firmly establish that Fred Sr. is actually looking for the piece of the Playing Spirit disc, and it's also entirely possible that he gave them the mystery as busy work, so he knew they would be out of the house, so he could look for it. But it's very clear that I should mention, I didn't bring this up, but in the episode they mentioned that there's actually two pieces that they know of, implying that somebody has the other one, and it's unclear whether or not it's Mr. E or Fred Sr. It's unclear which one of them has a piece. Possibly even Professor Pericles, but if Professor Pericles had one, we don't know. We don't know who has the other piece that they have up until this point. So for right now, it's just kind of a thing to keep in the back of your head. But in any case, yeah, that's gonna do it for my review of Scooby-Doo Mystery Incorporated. What did you guys think? Let's get a discussion going in the comment section down below, or over on my Discord server, link in the description. Anyway, thank you guys so much for watching. If you enjoyed, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Also, be sure to follow me on Twitter in the description below. And also be sure to check out my Patreon in the description below as well. It's only a couple bucks a month. It does really help me out, and you guys get access to a bunch of cool perks on my way saying thanks. So be sure to check those out. Link is down in the description. And finally, if you want to see more content from me, then be sure to check out the videos linked in the end screen. The top video is the most recent one. It may or may not be this one. Whereas above it was a video recommended to you based on what you've already seen from me. So if you want to try something new or see more of what you like, then be sure to check both of those videos out. But in any case, thank you guys so much for watching. Until next time, I will see you guys in the next video. Peace!